Welcome to Getting the Answers, episode 21. And this episode is going to be over the Middle East conflict and updates that are happening now with it. And I'm joined today with my amazing co host, and I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Yes, hello, I'm Anwiltus. I'm happy to be here to talk about the Middle East, particularly the current events in Israel and Palestine, and the historical origins, partially of that, and also perhaps some solutions.
Yes, for myself and maybe many other people around my age, I kind of knew briefly that there was a conflict between the two nations and in some ways other nations around that area as well, but I didn't really know extensively how big this problem was until this stuff was happening now, and I was like, okay, I'm going to look into this because I'm always a fan of looking into history of things because I think history gives you a good understanding. Do I always do that? No, not really. But in this case, I was like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Well, that's that. The history of this is a extremely long history and is very complex, and you can see how both sides could be angered by what maybe Britain did in some cases, or what the United States did, or what the UN did. There's several different variations too. You could see where if you were that nation, you might be a little bit angry. So I thought that that was kind of interesting, and it gave a good understanding of why it's happening now in some ways.
Yes, and to emphasize once again, we are not complete experts on the situation or on the internal politics of Israel or Palestine. So we will be looking at the situation more broadly from a more external perspective.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I would definitely not consider myself an expert on this, especially because of how deeply involved everything is. Uh, I could definitely tell why there's experts when it comes to this conflict compared to some other events. But anyway, we don't need to get into that. So, it's complex to figure out where to start when we look back at the history just a little bit to help our audience maybe understand it from our perspective of what we think the problem with the conflict is. When you look back in history and find like videos or websites just kind of talking about a timeline of the Middle East conflict, or the reasons why the conflict happened, or why things got heated between Israel, Palestine, and other nations, I think it comes down to the first major event was with Britain and what Britain decided to do with the Middle East territory, and therefore the two major things of Israel and Palestine. Uh, what do you think about that situation? And maybe you could say something else on that, but I think that's the first major thing where I see some people start to say that some nations were left bitter.
Yeah, well, I think that something that's important to emphasize is that a lot of people nowadays have a very anachronistic view of history where they think that this region was always in conflict or that there was never a time when people could peaceably live together in the Middle East. But in fact, that's not true because, for example, under the Ottoman Empire, there was a situation of significantly greater peace for a longer period of time. Now, that being said, just as in any other part of the world, it's not always peaceful. But the tensions that exist today certainly did not exist back then. Um, so the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I led to France and Britain and some of the Arab countries taking control of various parts of the Middle East. So, for example, the Hashemite dynasty that currently rules Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan. For a time, they ruled Syria and Iraq and parts of Arabia before that. But then the Saudis came in. Um, and with the Saudis also came the rise of Wahhabism, which was a more aggressive ideology or religious viewpoint to say that, but the way it treats Sharia law, you could also call it a political ideology at the same time. And also, after the Middle East came out of the rule of the Turks and came back into the rule of more native people, but under the rule of European powers overall, but having on a local government, a more native government, you also see a rise of nationalism in the region. You see a rise in Arab nationalism. So you have the Ba'athists in Iraq and Syria, and they currently still rule Syria. So we see a sort of fundamentalist Wahhabist movement rising. We also see an Arab nationalist movement rising, and we also see the involvement of the British and the French in ruling that area at the time, as well as foreign occupiers that don't really have an interest in ruling those areas in the long term, but through World War II, they rule those areas, and then afterwards, both Britain and France are very bankrupt following World War II. Europe is economically depressed, and that leads to a situation where those areas of the Middle East now have an opportunity to gain freedom from colonialism. And of course, in World War II as well, what we see is the Holocaust. And I think a lot of Israelis, a lot of Jews, although not all of them, to be fair here, consider the Holocaust a very important event. And some of them consider it an ideological or even religious basis for the need of establishing a Jewish homeland. And that's where the Zionism starts rising. Now, it started up before the Holocaust. The British had ideas that maybe they could put Jewish settlers in the land, and there were Jews that migrated into that land. And of course, there's multiple religious groups in the region. You have the Jews, the Druze, the Alawites, the Sunni Muslims, the Shia Muslims. There's Christians of various groups that historically live in the land and that had been peaceful with each other under the Ottomans, but through new risings in nationalism, in Zionism, in Wahhabism, in more identitarian movements. I think that's a good way to put it. We see tension between various groups rising, and the British, in the meantime, are ruling the Mandate of Palestine, are ruling what today is Israel and the Palestinian territories and Jordan. And after World War II in the 1940s, we see already a rising resistance movement by various Jewish groups that engage in terrorist attacks against the British occupiers.
Right, very much. I'm going to move to this next source that's going to give some visuals for everybody. And this is actually a pretty comprehensive timeline. And I'm going to put it in the description once we finish here if anyone wants to view it themselves. But this was by USA Today. And I'm going to scroll down to its map real quick, just so everybody gets a visual. Because I know... I don't want to generalize too much, but I know that a lot of Americans tend to not be particularly too well at geography, and I think you can include that for myself, so I feel safe saying that. But anyway, so that gives a perspective of the areas that we are talking about, and because Israel is actually not that big of an area or big of a place by any means. And sometimes I think, especially people who aren't good at geography, could get confused on that. But this also gives a very good timeline of what you were just giving a summary of about the Ottoman Empire and the British government ruling that area for a good while. And then goes down and talks about some Jews that were killed in 1929 and after World War, about the Holocaust, as you just mentioned. And then it goes down to one of the more major conflicts with this situation, and that is what counts as whose territory. And you started to kind of see that with the United Nations getting involved a little bit later on, and I don't think we're quite at that date yet. But even at the early stages, the United Nations was kind of a little bit involved with what land counts as whose. And you have your disputed territories with Gaza.
Well, this would be right at the very beginning of the United Nations.
Yes.
Because the United Nations was founded after World War II, and these events come to a head right after World War II.
Yes.
So this is the United Nations at the very, very beginning of its existence, dealing with a crisis in Israel where the British are deciding to pull out of Israel. Israel is declaring independence, and immediately they enter into a conflict with Palestinians, because the way the British had decided to divide up the land between those groups, they had decided to split the city of Jerusalem into two parts, and to have Israel run sort of north to south as a sliver of land, with large chunks being given to the Palestinian Arabs. And of course, after this war began, the War of Independence, as some call it, or the Palestinian War, what we see is neighboring powers, Jordan, Egypt, and others, become involved in the war, and they put the territories that now are Palestinian territories under a military occupation.
Yes, definitely.
Territories that were formerly the British Mandate, but now Israel is declaring independence, and they put them under military occupation, including the eastern part of Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah. That's why I was kind of saying that later on the UN made a major decision, but this was a couple years after this date here. But from what I could tell with reading some sites, it looked like the UN still was a little bit involved in this first part as well. But I'm going to scroll back up just a little bit, because in 1929 you start to see the first sign of conflict past the Holocaust, where 67 Jews were killed in the Hebron, I believe I said that right, Hebron massacre, as part of Palestine riots against Jewish immigration into Palestine. So you started to see a first mark there. And then in this conflict here, it states that 2 million Palestinians were displaced.
Yeah. And I think it's worth to note that one of the gripes that the Palestinians had against the way that the British intended to divide the region was that, despite the fact that the Palestinians at the time were a majority in land area, they were not assigned that proportionally, and that upset them. And also, the way that the land was divided obviously would lead to a situation where, if they wanted to have that separation, as some people were interested in having, they would have to displace large numbers of people in various regions to move. I suppose it would be similar to the division between India and Pakistan that was happening at around this time as well, where the Hindus had to move into what today is India, and the Muslims had to move into Pakistan and Bangladesh, which at the time was also part of Pakistan. Uh, and you could say that it's a somewhat similar situation, although obviously geopolitically it's not exactly the same.
Yes, is according to this, it says in 1947, the UN. This is the date I was talking about, and this is what I believe you were just talking about as well. They decide to divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states and make Jerusalem an international city. Arabs reject the plan, which is later dropped, and that was also an effort to divide territories. And I don't think I need to repeat what you just said, but I think that that is a lot of what Palestinians were angry about, and I could see how they could possibly be angry on that, because, like I was saying on earlier, or I think I said earlier, I don't think either side is fully perfect or is only right. I think both sides are a little bit gray on who is the better side, but I do think that it's a battle of who's the biggest enemy, and then you could argue on who is the biggest enemy. It's kind of
Yeah,
the perspective.
and I think this plan, in my view, was doomed to fail, and the reason is, for one, the division of Jerusalem as a city becomes necessary in this plan because if you're establishing separate Jewish and Arab states, for the Muslims, Jerusalem is a very important city, as it is for the Jews, and therefore both of them want the city. Uh, but currently, what you have is the Al Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, and in that sense, the Muslims have a mosque there that is extremely important to them, while the Hebrews do not have that there. But the city and the Temple Mount is also extremely important to them, and therefore having a divided city, in my view, well, I don't mind the idea of dividing cities into multiple districts or boroughs and things like that, but having a city divided between two different countries is, in my view, geopolitically not a good position, especially if you are in a region where there's tension between these two groups. Because if there weren't tension, let's say if this happened in the Netherlands or Belgium, someplace like that, then it wouldn't have been as bad of a problem. But because it's in a place where the people are so divided on their religion and their values, and are being more radicalized recently due to identitarian movements, it brings in a potential for conflict. And for the Jews settling in the region, it puts them in a position where they have to be very careful and very defensive, because their opponents have a potentially large number of allies in the surrounding geographical region, which they at that time do not, uh, which puts them in a very hard position. So I think, in my opinion, I don't think the idea of settling uh, Jews in Palestine was a good idea in the first place. Um, Even though I understand why people did it independently of the government for religious reasons, uh, I think that in a political sense, it was the wrong time for such a movement to occur uh, in relation to the politics of the Middle East. Uh, so, in that sense, it set them up for future conflict. And unfortunately, that's what we're still seeing today.
Yes, yes, of course. Which is very sad, and I mean, honestly, I don't know if you could ever split up a nation or a state if you want to go to like a local example. The people are very divided just themselves, and even in foreign countries, people are divided. Now, it may be more partisan in the United States now, but that's kind of besides the point. But when it comes to Israel and Palestine, as you mentioned, there is a huge religious perspective on this between the Jewish people and the Palestinian people who are majority Muslim and the perspectives that they have with their religion. And that's a huge push to Jerusalem and Holy Lands in the area and whatnot. And I think that that is very important as part of what's led to a lot of conflict as well between the two nations. But as I was mentioning earlier, and as you said, I don't really think you could even do that, even if you don't have two countries that are have huge religious motivations that are on opposites of each other. Uh, yeah, I don't even think you could do that without that. So I do think it was also doomed to fail, and has led to probably some of the conflict as well.
Yeah. But the problem is that the UN, however, has a very strong commitment to maintaining the geopolitical status quo. So they're not interested in situations that would cause the borders to change significantly nowadays, uh, because unfortunately, a lot of these borders were drawn at a time by people that weren't too interested in what was happening in a lot of these regions. And now we see a situation where the borders could be adjusted into a more favorable position, but the UN is not interested in that prospect. They're more interested in ideas of self determination of peoples, in the status quo of borders, in preventing uh, the military expansion of countries. Then they're interested in having a stable position for those countries themselves internally. Uh, so I think maybe we can get to this later. Continue with your timeline.
Yeah, the UN, we could spend a whole episode on that, but I do have a question about the UN, but we can get to that later, of course. The next major thing I had on my notes was what I thought was interesting, at least, was in 1957, where Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal and bars Israel ships from using it. Another shipping route, oh, sorry, the Straits of Tehran. I think I said that right. Anyway, another shipping route. Israel, aided by Britain and France, invades Egypt. The Soviet Union, an ally of Egypt, threatens nuclear retaliation, and the U.S. pressures Britain, France, and Israel forces to withdraw. So even though that wasn't directly Palestine in this event, I still think it shows tension between a lot of the nations in the area and an historic event on who decides to kind of back who, even if they already had, say, treaties with each other. But I thought that that was a big event as well.
Yeah, the Straits of Tehran are, if I remember correctly, the straits at the end of the Gulf of Aqaba, uh, which is on the Red Sea. So it's the point where the Sinai Peninsula meets Saudi Arabia with the Gulf of Aqaba in between. So Israel has a port on that city, and I suppose the theoretical shipping route would have been uh, that Israel could ship overland from places like Tel Aviv uh, to Eilat, and then ship from there. But uh, they came into trouble there. So I think one of the important factors in Israel's success, despite being surrounded by opponents in this time period, is that there was a lot of strong European support for Israel at the time. And this is partially because a lot of the people that migrated to Israel were from European countries. It's also partially because of the ideological fallout of the events of the Holocaust in some way. And of course, in the broader spectrum, it is a continuation of Cold War policies where, as you had mentioned, Egypt at the time was more aligned with the Soviet Union, and therefore Egypt's opponent in the conflict, Israel, received the support of the West. So Israel, a lot of people are very critical of the support that the US and other countries have for Israel. But I think one of the important elements is the greater geopolitical position of various countries, where Israel is not necessarily, from a strategic point, supported by the US simply because of things that are inherent to Israel, but rather due to greater geopolitical conflicts and grand strategy.
Mm-hmm. I think that is. I think that is very true. The only thing I can add on to that, and is another thing what the United Nations did in response to this, was sending their peacekeepers. And for those that don't know what those are, it's essentially the United Nations police, except they're not really able to do anything, or they're supposed to not able to do anything, as with like guns or arrest or things like that. They're very more of a like authority figure, but that's about it. And I don't know if you think
what the peacekeepers are,
yeah,
is that they are part of the militaries of member countries of the UN, and they don't actively fight directly as a military force against someone, but they usually establish areas like buffer zones where they are the ones that are militarily patrolling an area between two countries that might be at war with each other, but are in a ceasefire. So that's one example of how peacekeepers operate.
And we see this later that the Six-Day War grows out of this conflict, and Egypt orders the UN forces to leave and to close the Straits of Tehran to Israel again, and plans a secret attack against Israel. So that was later that year. So you can see some effort of them not wanting to give up on the fight, and some hatred against Israel for that. I'm going to scroll down.
And the Six-Day War is important because I believe it's at this point that Israel, they defeat all of their neighbors which attack them, and then they take over the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights, I believe at this point, as well as the Sinai Peninsula, and therefore the line of battle advances all the way to the Suez Canal, which leads to what is called the Suez Crisis, because of the fact that there's military conflict right on the Suez Canal, which was a huge problem and led to the intervention of other countries to seek a more peaceful resolution, because a long-term conflict on the Suez Canal at that point would have seriously disrupted trade routes, seriously disrupted the economy worldwide, and therefore it was to the advantage of the major powers to seek for a more peaceful resolution. but nevertheless, the lands that Israel occupied during the conflict remained occupied for many years to come.
Definitely so. One highlight, but before I mention the date, I wanted to mention was that Jimmy Carter, the president of United States, obviously met with the Egyptian prime minister and the Israeli prime minister to come up with a deal, and they ended up coming to a deal, but not everybody necessarily kept the deal or liked the deal. And that brings me to the next date I thought was worthy of bringing up, which is 1987, where Palestinians staged the first of two uprisings, or infidels, in Gaza, Israel.
Intifadas.
Intifadas, yeah. Anyway, in Gaza, Israel, thank you, and the West Bank, using mass boycotts, civil disobedience, and attacks on Israelis. More than 50 Israeli citizens are killed. The Infidala lasts more than 5 years, ending in September 1993.
Yeah, so it's a large campaign of protest and terrorism that occurred at that period in time against Israel, and I think it's worth noting that in Israel there are different perspectives that people take on these positions politically. I know that there's Jewish Israelis, who are anti-Zionist, who are not in favor of the identitarian establishment of their country and are more in favor of a political consolidation that is not based on Jewishness as a necessity. There are those people in Israeli politics. There's also people who are very strongly in favor of taking over the Temple Mount, demolishing the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and building a temple, and being very aggressive against the Palestinians and driving them out of the land. So what you see is there's different positions. You have more progressive types as well, and you have the more conservative types. There's Haredi Jews who are influential in politics in some places, although they're not the majority. So it's worth noting that they have in their parliament a number of different political groups that don't all agree on these ideas.
Yes, I think it would be foolish to think that, every Jew is the same in what they think of the nation, or every Palestinian is the same in what they think. I think there's a lot more nuance to the situations, especially when it comes to the politics of. I don't want to say politics of a religion, but it almost is politics of a religion when it comes to Jerusalem and what happens in that area.
Yeah, and some people say that it shouldn't be like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
I think this is a good point to talk about the solutions that people talk about primarily, and that is the two-state solution and the one-state solution.
Mm-hmm.
So the two-state solution is the solution politically that favors a normalization of relations between Israel, Palestine, and other countries, wherein Palestine exists as a separate and sovereign state to Israel, and that in that sense, that would essentially give the Palestinians their own land as self-determination, because most Palestinians, politically speaking, at least in their political parties that are in power, are not in favor of uniting with the Israelis to form a one-state solution, which a number of different proposals have been made for that. There's a unitary state where everybody together votes together. There's a federal idea where there would be federalism, and therefore the Palestinian territories would retain autonomy under a federal system, and therefore have self-governance as a portion of the overall state. But of course, another type of one-state solution would be the dominance of one group in the region, and that would be either the dominance of the Palestinians driving the Israelis out, or the Israelis driving the Palestinians out. And so there's that's essentially the rundown of basic one-state and two-state solutions. Now, there's other iterations of these, and that have various nuances to them, where they try to fix things in certain ways. Maybe it's a three-state solution where Gaza and West Bank are separate countries. What happens to the Golan Heights? Do they go back to Syria? Do they stay part of Israel? That's another question people have. So, and in these solutions, another big question is what happens to Jerusalem? Does Jerusalem become fully Israel? Does it become Palestinian? Does it become a split city? Or is it like like was originally designated by the British, a condominium where both countries would have a shared sovereignty over it? There's a number of different fallout of all of these decisions, especially concerning Jerusalem. And that's why it was a huge deal when Donald Trump decided to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, because under some provisions of international law, Israel's taking of East Jerusalem was not favored by the UN.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that these solutions would have to be involved in a peace deal or some sort of deal between the nations? Because there's been many presidents that have tried, including President Trump and President Bill Clinton, and even going back to like Jimmy Carter. Presidents have tried many a time. So do you think that one of these solutions would have to be involved?
By the way, are you done with your timeline?
I have a few more for dates. We can go back to that one quick.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we're not getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good.
Okay, but well, anyway, on the solutions, there's two possible ways to solve this problem. One is through negotiation and cooperation, which is what everybody says that they should do. But honestly speaking, as long as Hamas is the leading party of Palestine, particularly in Gaza, that's not going to happen because they're not willing to get into a situation where they would want that. Hamas is militaristic. They do want to take over territory from the Jewish Israelis, and therefore the alternative option is the imperial solution, where one side defeats the other side militarily, conquers a territory, and then maybe they might grant concessions to the locals, or if they're not feeling generous, they might oppress the locals or expel them or act cruelly to them in some way.
Right. Yeah, that definitely makes some sense for sure. Because I don't want to get too ahead, so I'll say what I was going to say after we finish these last few dates here. So 2005 is interesting date that Israel withdraws from Gaza but remains control. Then their response to that in 2000.
That's an important thing to get into. What exactly is the withdrawal from Gaza? That means that they're not actively militarily occupying it, although they do fully control the border, the airspace, the coast with Gaza, and therefore do have control theoretically of what goes in and out of the country, um, with some exceptions on the Egyptian side of things. Although Egypt isn't really that interested in supporting Palestine because Egypt nowadays is a U.S. ally, as is Israel, and they've gotten to a peace agreement. And Israel has also gotten to a peace agreement with Jordan, and so now Israel's neighbors that are actually aggressive against Israel are Lebanon, which isn't really in a position to do much currently, and Syria, which wants the Golan Heights back, but is involved in a civil war. So it primarily, most of the aggression that we see coming from those countries come from uh, non-governmental organizations. What you see is various terrorist groups as they're categorized. Um, but those countries themselves aren't really in a position to fight a war with Israel. And also Saudi Arabia, although Israel and Saudi Arabia do have not normalized relations, and it's actually a big political issue that Muslims in Israel, because there are a significant number uh, of Arabs who are Israeli citizens, even Palestinian Arabs that are Israeli citizens, and live in the actual Israeli controlled part of that region. Those have, in order to do the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, uh, they need permission from the government. And if they were to, let's say, travel to another country and then go through to Saudi Arabia without permission from the government, they could get into legal trouble with their government. So that is something that leads to some tension. But of course, uh, Saudi Arabia and Israel do not have, and therefore it makes sense that Israel would want to be careful about travel between itself and Saudi Arabia.
Right, allies oftentimes do change uh,
Yeah.
fairly often.
Currently, Saudi Arabia is aligned with the United States, so
Hmm.
the potential of a full blown conflict between Saudi Arabia and Israel is not likely currently.
Right, unless, yeah, right. uh, let's just cover the last two, and then we can start talking about the most recent events here. Where did I want it to go with this? Oh, we'll go to this date after, where Hamas, the militant Palestinian group, wins election in Gaza. You briefly talked about that, and I think that
Yeah.
that's a very important date.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that the two main political movements in Palestine are Hamas and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO used to be more militant, but nowadays has preferred to be more peaceful, but still supports a two-state solution and wants to get East Jerusalem back at least. And they are upset about Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And the leader of the PLO is currently ruling West Bank independently of the Hamas government in Gaza, uh, and is in a position where he's essentially unelected, or has been elected to serve for longer than would normally be allowable, and therefore by some would be considered a form of dictator. Um, Meanwhile, Hamas is interested in conquering land from Israel. So that's the party in government is Hamas. The opposition party is the PLO, and neither of them are in favor of a federal negotiation with Israel.
Which is very important to know, for sure. The last date I wanted to bring up, and you talked about that Trump moved the embassy, and in 2018 there was a big response to that, and I'll just read what they say here. Protesters break out on the Gaza-Israeli border as the U.S. embassy is relocated. Demonstrators throw explosives and rocks across the barrier fence and are met with gunfire and tear gas. At least 58 Palestinians are killed, the Gaza Health Ministry says. So that was a response directly to Trump moving the embassy. So it wasn't like his response was met with angry words. It was actually met with some actions from Palestinians as well, which I think is important. And that was in 2018.
And I think it's important to understand that I believe that currently I don't think a two-state solution is viable in the long term, even though a lot of Israel's neighbors have become less aggressive towards Israel. Some have made peace. The situation that Israel is in currently is a situation that will continue unless one side wins. And so we essentially are in a situation where I would say the logical outcome for Israel as a militarily superior country to the Palestinian territories, in response to a government that is explicitly interested in attacking Israel, I think they are justified in invading and taking over the territory in order to smooth out their borders. I don't think that they're justified in oppressing the Palestinians. And Israel does have laws that allow Palestinians to become Israeli citizens, and they do have laws regarding the freedom of religion. Although it is worth noting that there are certain parties in Israel that are opposed to these ideas and that want Israel to remain a Jewish country, both ethnically and religiously, and are not interested in any federal solution to the problem. So the real question is, how long are they going to wait until they resolve this issue? And when they resolve this issue, which party is going to be in power? Because the party that's in power when the issue is finally resolved will be the party that decides how the Palestinians are treated in Israel. And if it is a party that is favorable to the Palestinians, then they will receive rights and federalism. If it is a party that is opposed to the Palestinians, we might see perhaps a genocide. But we'll see what happens.
Right. I'm going to bring up this chart that I had up about deaths between all of the nations between Jewish and Palestine from 2008 down to 2020. So I'll scroll this up at the top for a little bit, and then I'll scroll down because it is slightly too big, but we'll fix it. Anyway, my first point here, and this is kind of what I was going to bring up as my first response to what you were saying. A lot of people, if you believe, like, say, Ben Shapiro, Dennis Prager, people like that who are content creators on the right. And Dennis Prager is Jewish as well, I believe. But I know Ben Shapiro is. I was listening to his show to see what he had to say about all of this a couple of days ago. And one of his major points that I've also seen from Dennis Prager before and other people like them was that, Palestinians are able to live freely, relatively, with Jewish people. And Ben Shapiro brought up an example of some Palestinian women and children who got hurt, and Jewish doctors and nurses were giving them aid. And according to him, he said that the Palestinian woman was almost shocked because she didn't think that it would happen if it was the other way around. And that's kind of the first thing I wanted to bring up. My second point was more on the opposite side, towards on the opposite side of this. A lot of Palestinians and people who support Palestinian, more of the left wing media, are saying that Israel's response to the most recent missile strikes and other events is way too harsh. So, in the case of the most recent stuff, Palestine's missiles were unguided. Israel's missiles were guided. Israel has a bigger military, and they're not afraid to use their military. So therefore, it results in more Palestinian deaths, and that is possibly why Palestinians are so angry. So I thought I would.
Here's what I have to say to that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? If somebody is launching rockets at your country, I think you're justified to take over that country that is launching rockets at your country. Now, the UN wouldn't be very happy about that, but I think that if that's going to stop the rockets from coming, I think that that's justified. Now that being said, I do agree somewhat that in some cases there has been perhaps excessive harshness in some areas. I don't agree with a lot of the people in the U.S. who support Israel unconditionally. I don't think that that's a reasonable position. And I think the reasonable reason for the U.S. to support Israel has to do not with anything Israel itself is doing or with any ties that the U.S. has with Israel, but more with how Israel is part of a network of U.S. allies in the region, where you have places like Turkey and Egypt, which are very important allies of the U.S., and Jordan, and then Israel is between all of these. And therefore, although Israel is not in a position to directly help the U.S. very much, Israel is part of this network. And I think if Israel were to actually pacify its own country and its borders, they would perhaps be in a better position to reciprocate the U.S.'s help to them. But another issue that comes into here is how much money the U.S. is sending Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And some people say that it's too much. And I'm going to be honest here. I understand that the U.S. supports and upholds a lot of militaries around the world. But in the actual amount of disbursements, I'm looking at explorer.usaid.gov for the year 2019, which is the most recent year in which we have full information available. What we see is that Egypt, which is strategically important because of the Gulf of Suez, received about $1.5 billion in disbursements from the U.S., and this aid is mostly military. And what we see is Turkey received $67 million in disbursements from the U.S., but this is mostly economic. And Turkey, even though it was fighting the Islamic State, Turkey has its own strong economy and its own stronger military. What we see is Jordan, another neighbor of Israel, receives about $1.6 billion in aid, and about $1.1 billion is economic, and about $500 million is military. And then Israel, which arguably is not in the most strategic position here, received about $3.3 billion in aid, almost all of which was military. And do we need to support Israel's military is a question. And let me just say here, I don't have anything particularly against the Jewish people. I don't have anything against the state of Israel. I don't want to disestablish or destroy Israel. Let me be very clear on that. But Israel has its own economy. It has a very strong economy compared to a lot of countries in the region. Israel has an arms industry of its own. Israel has a military that's very competent compared to its neighbors. Israel has allegedly nuclear weapons. And as such, I think that the U.S. support for Israel, compared to other countries in the region, which are strategically much more important in relation to current conflicts, is quite excessive. So I think that Israel should not be receiving as much military aid as it is receiving from the U.S.
That is a very good point, and I actually have a third article up to talk about that. But I first wanted to talk about what you said earlier. I do think it would be foolish for a nation not to respond if they're getting attacked on in any manner. And when you're talking about rockets or missiles or whatever you want to call it, you would think that they would want to respond back in a justified way. And also to the claim that I hear a lot of more leftist people making about their weapons being more advanced, such as guided missiles, and that they're able to target, particular areas, and why don't they just use ground forces, and, all the claims like that. Well, for one, Israel does have a history of calling places that are public, because Hamas has been known to have headquarters in public places, such as hospitals and daycares. They usually call before they launch the actual missile, which I think is a very good point to bring up.
That's true. And a case of this is the media building. Well, it was an office building, but it had offices for Al Jazeera, which is a news company in Arabia, and the Associated Press. And they called the building beforehand, and people evacuated, and then they demolished the building. And I must say, I saw the video of the demolition. It was not a huge explosion where it destroyed the entire city block. They demolished the building in a reasonable manner, I would say, for a military type demolition, that is to say. Now, a professional demolisher, a professional demolition, that is, would occur probably in a much more controlled manner. So, but if they assume that there was a military presence in that building, I think that the way that they went about demolishing the building was fine for that purpose. Now, I don't know whether there was a military presence in that building. That's obviously going to be a controversy because people have a vested interest in affirming and denying that point. But on the grounds of guided missiles versus unguided rockets, I would say that unguided rockets are much more likely to accidentally hit civilians, especially if they're fired with a poorly controlled mechanism from a range where you can't even determine where it lands. So it could hit literally anywhere. It could hit a school bus. It could hit a daycare. It could hit non-military targets. And at least Israel has the excuse that it gives for that they are hitting military targets. But in the case of Hamas, they are literally just firing missiles into an area and hoping that it hits places.
Yeah, it's
and honestly, the argument people use against the use of chemical weapons and bioweapons for the reason that you can't exactly control how the weapon affects an area because it might blow into a different area or might expand in an uncontrollable way. Those arguments apply in the same way to the arguments, to the usage of uh, firing willy-nilly, as you might say. That's also why in most places people aren't allowed to just simply fire off their guns in random directions, because that's a very irresponsible way to fire. And so the police, when they are in the U.S. anyway, when they fire a gun, they have they are held accountable for knowing where that gun uh, is going to hit. So they have to have a reasonable knowledge of where that gun is going to hit. Now, obviously, there's still accidents that happen. There's still situations where a bullet might ricochet, or the aim might be off and it hits somewhere where it's not supposed to hit. But generally speaking, that is considered a decent and responsible way to operate that. So in the case of a war where you're not firing at a military front line and you're intentionally firing into population centers, I think that's very different from at least saying that you're hitting military targets, whether it's true or not.
Right.
So we can actually go after the fact and examine whether there was perhaps a military installation wherever the guided missiles hit. But in the case of Hamas firing the rockets, they literally don't have any control of where they're hitting and have a very decent chance of hitting civilian targets. And I think they don't mind. So if people are going to take a moral stance on this, and they're going to say that Israel is bad for having actual control of who their missiles are hitting, I think those people don't really have a reasonable understanding of how weapons work, perhaps, or they don't have an understanding or an understanding of the idea of responsibility for people's actions.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was cases of, well, alleged cases of Hamas firing rockets and hitting their own people if they, didn't launch that well, or many other cases. So, I mean, the idea of having guided missiles and it being bad, like, they say they're targeting military leaders, and you've kind of talked already about that. But even if they're not targeting military leaders and say they're targeting, I don't know, maybe media members or whatever case it is, I don't really think that they would be targeting civilians, because then why would they call? That doesn't really make too much sense. So they're targeting somebody. But let's just say, whatever who...
Well, they're not targeting people, because if they were targeting people, they wouldn't call ahead, because they want the people to not evacuate.
Right. So that doesn't really make too much sense.
But Hamas, once again, is known for operating in densely populated areas. They're known for putting their military installations in the middle of civilian areas rather than in separate camps. And that leads to a possibility of collateral damage that Hamas is all too willing to take. And the reason they're willing to take the possibility of being hit and having their civilians die is because they know that it drums up media lines and support for Palestine and villainization of Israel, when Israel in that situation could simply be taking a reasonable attack strategy. Because if you're going to use civilians as human shields, then the strategic question here becomes, are you going to, as someone who's facing someone that is using civilians as human shields, are you going to simply not attack and get shot? Or are you simply going to attack anyway and ensure that at least people on your side aren't the people that are getting shot? So in that sense, I think that a lot of people are so overly concerned with civilians not getting harmed that they don't that they aren't worried about the fact that Hamas is deliberately creating situations wherein civilians would have to be harmed uh, for Israel to defend itself. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that being said, I think that Israel is not defending itself not accurately. I don't think Israel is defending itself as fervently as it should. I think that Israel, if they are under attack, that they should win. I think that victory is the fastest path to peace here, because in Palestine, what we see is new generations are being indoctrinated through the Palestinian media into having as an ideological and religious precept the killing of the Jews. That's considered very important uh, to the propaganda campaign that is being put forward, that they have to kill the Jews, they have to uh, conquer their land, that they have to do this militarily, and young children are being indoctrinated into this, and therefore the future generations have established a a cultural background that is going to lead to future conflict. So the fastest way to deal with it, or the way that would lead to the fewest deaths, would simply to actually fight this out as a war and win, rather than waiting and establishing the Iron Dome to shoot down missiles, and simply waiting and agreeing with the UN's terms that they have to keep the status quo, despite the fact that there's a political party leading a country that is actively desiring to attack and kill civilians. So, in that sense, this is a situation where the most direct action would lead to uh, the the least loss of life, even if in the short term, a lot more people would die due to the full escalation of military conflict.
I could definitely see where you're coming from on that for sure. It's kind of the concept of endless war because the nations are kind of at war with each other in a large way and have been for many years. And that is definitely a way to end it. and
Yeah,
I don't.
and that being said,
Yeah, go on.
let me just say Israel isn't innocent. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the colonies that they put in the West Bank. Now, obviously, Israel considers that to be their territory, so it makes sense internally to do that. However, externally, it's going to be viewed very duplicitously by Israel's political adversaries, because they are appropriating land from another group and fencing it off and militarizing it uh, to defend it against potential attackers from the countryside. And so in that sense, while I understand that if you consider it to be your land, it makes sense to do that. I think you really shouldn't be doing that until you've at least taken care of the government that is leading those people that you're building colonies in that land for. So that is to say, they have to deal with Hamas, they have to deal with the PLO before they actually do that, because if they don't, then they are entering into a position where people claim the land and they're ruling over large parts of this land, and you're moving in and taking that land, and it leads to an escalation of conflict, sort of similar to how, as the US was expanding, there were various Indian tribes, and if people started building towns in areas where they didn't have a treaty with the Indians dividing their territory, you could end up in conflict. You could end up in the towns being attacked by the Indians, or the colonists becoming aggressive against the Indians who are intruding on perhaps their farmland or something. So, in that sense, it's a situation that leads to conflict. It's a situation that I understand how it makes sense internally, politically speaking, but I don't think it is a wise move to do that because it also leads to uh, international disapproval for Israel. And understand that actually taking over the Gaza Strip would be a big deal for the UN, but I think that in the long term they'll get over it. Uh, so in that sense, I see that there.
Right, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about, and it was about the military aid, real quick, before we have to get out here, because this is about the same time period that the conflict was actually happening with the missile strikes. So this is the most recent article I can find about it, and this was about Bernie Sanders wanting to block the aid that Biden ended up signing. So his effort to block it ended up failing, and Biden went ahead and signed the deal. But this deal was a $735 million arms sale to Israel, capping off the long effort, calling off the long shot sitting effort by Bernie to block this. So Bernie, AOC, and some others were trying to block this bill that Biden ended up signing to give Israel more support. So, and their reason for blocking it was to not have the conflict increase, and they thought it was dangerous giving Israel money as the conflict was happening.
Well, Israel has its own arms. It has its own arms industry. I think Israel probably has the resources to completely win a war at this point. I don't think that they need to buy weapons from the U.S. or have a big discount from the U.S. To do this. So in that sense, it's essentially far too late if they don't want the situation to escalate. I think it's entirely up to the people that are directly involved here, Israel and Palestine. Now, in regards to the most recent situation, why are the tensions overflowing nowadays? Well, there are some Palestinian families in part of Jerusalem that were being sued and with a potential for eviction. And what I had heard is that this was based on land that was sold many decades ago, that therefore the land wasn't theirs, but they were living on it. But it was so many decades ago, before the establishment of the State of Israel, even. So it sounds somewhat dubious to me. Now, it could be true, but still, this caused backlash from various Palestinians. And in advance of a parade by Israeli Zionists and nationalists that was celebrating the conquest of East Jerusalem, the police, the Israeli police, went and did a raid on the Al-Aqsa Mosque with rubber bullets, under the allegation that the people inside, or that some people had brought in improvised weapons or rocks to throw, or Molotov cocktails. And based on that allegation, they went in, and they actually went in multiple times to do raids. And that seriously upset not just the Palestinians in the Palestinian territories, but Palestinians throughout Israel and Arabs in neighboring countries, because the Al-Aqsa Mosque is very sacred to the Muslims, and Jewish police officers entering into there and engaging in violence inside was considered a big problem. Now, that being said, if the allegations were true, I can see why they did it. Um, there may have been perhaps more tactful ways to deal with it. I'm not an expert on policing in Israel, but this, of course, then led to the escalation in rockets being fired by Hamas, and then Israel responds with its own targeted strikes, and that's the situation where we're at.
Yes, yes, and if the tension's high, it doesn't necessarily take something to cause people to do something like this. You know what I mean? Like you could see that kind of with a large part. People argued that the U.S. was waiting to go to war for something to happen so that they could then say that they were ready to go into war. Talking about the world wars, but I mean that's debatable. But I think something like this, especially, it doesn't necessarily take that much to trigger something and say, okay, now we can do it.
Yeah, and it's obviously a big problem for Israel because Israel, if they do mess with the Al Aqsa Mosque, they will antagonize many of their neighbors because most of the countries in the region are majority Islamic countries. That being said, Israel itself it has Muslims in it. It has different types of Judaists in it. In fact, uh, many denominations of Judaism aren't allowed to have official marriages in Israel. They have to go to other countries to have them because of uh, the way in which religious authorities in Israel operate. I think that's a bit weird. I don't think it should be that way. Um, but of course, Israel has put itself in a position where it has gained a greater demographic advantage uh, through partially its law of return, which essentially preferences immigration from the types of people that would be most likely to support Israel on its side anyway. Now, of course, we have to be very careful about criticizing law of return because, according to some organizations, criticism of that is anti-Semitic. I I think it's a policy position. I can criticize the policy position I like, um, so I don't really care about that. But I think a a problem, a related issue is American support for Israel, because I understand it from a strategic perspective, even though I did say that I think it's disproportionate to Israel's utility as an ally. Um, but I also think that there is a large amount of religious support in the U.S. for Israel, not just by Jewish persons, even though there are very many Jewish persons that actually don't like Israel, to be honest. Um, but for example, dispensationalists in the United States, it's one of the eschatological views among Christians, uh, although it wasn't very common until late 19th century. That view sees Israel as being very important uh, for future prophecy, and therefore the establishment of Israel as a sovereign state and the potential rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem are considered very important. And so you also have a dual covenant view that some people hold, where uh, Judaism and Christianity are considered equally valid as religions. Although the people that are heavy into the idea of Judeo-Christian values, I don't think that that's necessarily a logical position, unless you literally take that viewpoint, even though I don't think even at that point it's not internally consistent. Uh, because although there is a definite overlap between values of various groups of Judaism and various groups of Christianity, which also are diverse from each other, I think I should emphasize. I think that there are distinctions and differences in values, and that those are real differences that do influence policies that people make. and therefore I I don't think I would subscribe to the idea of uh, of saying that Judeo-Christian values are united. But that's just my opinion on that.
Yeah, I think you're. I think that that's probably pretty true, especially when it comes to the conflict here. Because I would think, and this may not be true, but I would think if there was one united thought on this perspective with the Jewish people and maybe even Christian people, even though and Christianity are different in some ways. But anyway, regardless of that, if there was one united thought, I think that there would be a way to resolve the conflict and not necessarily have to go to more drastic things like you were mentioning are a peace treaty of dividing the nation or halving the nation or whatever that case may be.
Yeah.
That may
Well,
not be
because
entirely true, but yeah.
the geographic position of the country means that it, it's not really viable due to the size of the country uh, to separate it into two opposing nations, especially when you consider the surrounding countries and the potential rivalries here. So I do hope that there is peace in the future. I do hope that uh, that Palestinians and Jews can get along in the future. That is a sincere hope of mine. Um, I, I, however, don't think that this will happen uh, as a two-state solution. I don't think that this will happen through peaceful negotiation. I think that both sides, or at least on the Palestinian side under the current government, there is a commitment to resolving this through conflict. And I think Israel has the right, due to the opposing side's aggression, to also use conflict as military force as a means to resolve the conflict. However, all I hope for is that after whatever happens, that the governance the government will be beneficial to them. Obviously, I'm also not too happy about the way in which Israeli policies work, because what we see is that though Israel has a freedom of religion in its laws, what we see is on a more practical level of implementation, what we see is sometimes there is a bit of harassment that goes on against people like Christian missionaries from political sources in Israel. That's not to say the law against giving people financial incentives to change their faith. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how Israel treats missionaries in general. As a Christian, I would prefer a more even-handed system, is what I'm saying. Not just in policy, but also in practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, war is never going to be pretty if that is the solution that has to happen between the two nations, and it's possible that it could even be worse after it, depending on which political movement takes place in Israel or whatever you want to call the nation that comes off from the war. Because war itself isn't always going to bring the best results, is I guess the best way of putting it. Now, in this case, could it be better than what's happening now in just endless conflicts for another 25, 30, 40, 50, whatever years it's going to be? That you could definitely argue.
Yeah. And another argument I hear that I don't think we actually got into is the question of who actually has the right to rule this land. And I think that this is an interesting question, because there's people, I don't know if Ben Shapiro does this, but I hear some people in the US on the conservative side going back all the way back to ancient Israel and saying that that makes it legitimate for Israel to control the land today. Um, I because I don't subscribe to the religious positions that would lead to that, or to the idea of Aboriginal land ownership. And by the way, the Israelis aren't even the Aboriginals of the region anyway. But because I don't support those ideas, I end up going into political realism and saying that the land belongs to those who control it, uh, and that while I would not have given the land specifically to the Israelis at the beginning, I think now they have control of the land, and therefore it is their land because they control it. And in international relations, this is a concept called uti possidetis. Uh, and likewise, the Palestinians, they lived in the land for a very long time, but now they have lost control of it in some ways, and a lot of the people that were displaced are still alive, and there are people that have decided to politically integrate into Israel as well, and who therefore retain themselves on the land. And so I don't think that it is a good or legitimate idea to just push these people off of their land when they haven't, uh, in the case that they haven't done anything criminal or belligerent that would warrant them to be pushed off their land. I don't think that that's a good idea. In the case that they have done those things, then I can see the reasoning for doing so. So, in that sense, I think that the individual Palestinians who own land should retain that land, but sovereignly speaking, because of the actions of the government of Palestinians, it makes sense for Israel to take an overall political control of the land, although politically speaking, Israel would then, due to the way that its parliamentary system works and the way that they allow Palestinians to receive citizenship, they would not be a unified Jewish country. They would be a country of Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis, as they already are to a large extent. But it would shift the balance a bit more, and I don't know what the political situation would look like then, but maybe we'll find out someday.
Yep, I think that Shapiro. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think in general he thinks that it should be Jewish land regardless, and period, and probably from a more biblical perspective, but I'm not sure. But to what you were saying after that, I would. I don't really, to be honest, I don't really see anything that goes against kind of what you were saying. Really, it makes the most sense to me from my perspective as well. The only counter, I guess, just to throw something out there that I thought about, was the fact of, well, wouldn't it be unfair to say it's just one nation's rule of the land just because they own it now, when in the past it wasn't theirs? That would be, I guess, the only counter I have to that.
Yeah, well, in the past, it wasn't the Israelis either. There's been tons of people in that land for all of history. So if we're going to seriously take that position, then would have to that I want any American of European or African or Asian descent who takes that position to leave the continent and go back to your homeland. Okay, if you're seriously going to take that position, the logical outcome of that position, and therefore that's how it would play out. But in the case of Aboriginal land rights, I think there is a legitimate position that says that people can gain land fair and square, and even if the land was originally not gained fair and square, uh, that people shouldn't really be fully accountable for everything that their ancestors did. So, in that sense, if 500 years ago Group X conquered land from Group Y, and now people are bringing it up, I don't think that that's really a legitimate point. So, when the when people are looking at that land was ruled by the Egyptians, it was ruled by the Assyrians, it was ruled by the Babylonians, it was ruled by the Turks, it was ruled by the Crusaders from Europe, it was ruled by Arabs, it was ruled by the Romans, by Greeks, it was ruled by a lot of different people, and many generations passed, and many of these people ruled the land multi-generationally and inhabited the land and lived in the land, and I just don't think it's a legitimate position, to be honest. The only way that the only argument people can make that I think gives an air of legitimacy to that position is if you talk about religious concepts. And while I am a religious person, I think that, in my view, my understanding of a religious concepts don't point towards this being a legitimate position. And I understand that there's people that disagree with me. I understand that people will accuse me of things like replacement theology and things like that. And and that's not my position. I'm going to be very clear. I hold to covenant theology, but I don't agree with the dispensationalists. I don't agree with the dual covenant, and therefore I also don't agree with Hebrew Zionism from a Jewish religious perspective, and therefore I simply can't support that from a religious basis. I can't support that from a historical basis. I can, however, support from a realistic basis that they are in control of the land today.
Mm-hmm. I don't know too much about the other theories, but it's definitely something I can look into just to be able to form a response on that. But I don't necessarily know too much about those other two to have a counter question to that. I guess to kind of end today's episode, I thought we could each give kind of a summary on the topic and basically answer, do we think that this is going to continue, or do you think that there's going to be an end sometime?
Well, as I said, it's all up to the people directly involved. I don't think that the UN is really going to do anything that's going to stop this. I don't think that the neighboring countries currently have any will to intervene directly in a way that would stop this. I think it's all up to the Palestinians and the Israelis, both Jewish and Arab and other groups, and how they want to resolve the conflict. I don't think that we're going to be seeing a long-term two-state solution simply because of the geopolitics of a region. The borders wouldn't make sense. I don't think that we're going to see a peaceful integration because none of the major Palestinian parties are interested in that. And therefore, I do believe that the most likely outcome is going to be a military victory for Israel. And the real question is, does Israel have the willpower to do this, or are they going to prolong their current situation?
And to answer that question on my end, I would say, although the cease order potentially stopped the conflict from happening now, I haven't seen any recent missile strikes or anything like that. So at least for now, it appears to have been stopped. I do think that it's most likely going to continue here in the future because I do not see a peace treaty being signed with President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister and the government of Palestine. I don't see them coming to a peace treaty or anything like that. I don't necessarily see any deal really being made, and I didn't necessarily think of war being a solution until you were giving your ideas about it. And I don't ultimately know if that's the smartest decision to be made on Israel's part as the aggressors potentially, but I think that that may be the only solution that they have to if they want to end this conflict and nothing happens in the future. But in short, I think that the conflict is most likely just going to continue, and there's really not going to be any sort of progress on it.
Yeah, that is a legitimate possibility.
So I'll go ahead and let you shout out anything that you may be having on your channel or whatever shout outs you want to give.
Well, I would say I don't really have anything in particular. You can also check out my book, Actionable Justice, on Taurus Networks or for Amazon Kindle. If you are interested in giving me any suggestions, feel free to write to me on the comments of one of my recent YouTube videos. I'll see if I can make something happen there.
And Getting the Answers episode 22 is going to be on Anna Volta's channel next Thursday at the same time, 10 a.m. Central Time or 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So make sure to check that one out. And of course, you can also let us know if you want to hear anything on the show we have every Thursday, and we'll make sure to potentially cover those topics. So thank you everybody for stopping by, and we highly appreciate